Close your eyes and let your mind drift back through the centuries, back to a time when the world was shrouded in mystery, superstition, and the ever-present shadow of death. Tonight we're going to explore one of history's most fascinating and terrifying professions, that of the medieval plague doctor. But before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe only if you genuinely enjoy my content. Tonight's tale isn't just about the iconic beaked figures that haunt our Halloween decorations and steampunk fantasies. We're going to dive deep into the reality of what it would actually be like to live as one of these mysterious figures. We'll explore why, despite your modern knowledge, your advanced understanding of medicine, and your 21st century sensibilities, you would likely find yourself overwhelmed, terrified, and quite possibly dead within mere hours of stepping into those leather boots. So settle in, get comfortable, and prepare to discover why the life of a plague doctor was far more complex, dangerous, and psychologically demanding than you might imagine. This is a story of medicine and superstition, of courage and terror, of humanity's struggle against an invisible enemy that killed without mercy or discrimination. Are you ready? Then let's begin our journey into the dark, fascinating world of the medieval plague doctor. Picture this. You wake up tomorrow morning, but instead of checking your phone or brewing your coffee, you find yourself standing in a narrow cobblestone street that reeks of human waste, rotting food, and something else, something sickeningly sweet, that makes your stomach turn. The air is thick with smoke from countless fires, and the sound of church bells echoes endlessly through the fog. Welcome to your first day as a plague doctor in 14th century Europe. The year is 1348, and you're in the bustling port city of Marseille, France. Just 3 days ago, a merchant ship arrived from the east, carrying silks, spices, and something far more deadly than anyone could have imagined. The crew was found dead at their posts, their bodies covered in dark, swollen lumps that seemed to have burst from their flesh like grotesque flowers. The few survivors who made it to shore were babbling about a curse, about cities in the east where the dead outnumbered the living 10 to 1. But you don't know any of this yet. All you know is that you've been summoned by the city's mayor, a rotund man named Guillaume de Grimaud, who's desperately trying to maintain order as reports of a strange sickness begin to trickle in from the docks. He's heard that you're learned in the medical arts, that you've studied the ancient texts of Galen and Hippocrates, and that you possess knowledge that might help save his city. What Guillaume doesn't know is that you're not actually from this time period. You're a modern person with modern sensibilities, modern knowledge of medicine, and modern expectations of hygiene and safety. You know about bacteria and viruses, about antiseptics and antibiotics, about the importance of washing your hands and sterilizing instruments. You know that the Black Death is caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, typically spread by fleas that have fed on infected rats. You know that it will kill approximately 1/3 of Europe's population before it's finished. But here's the thing, knowing all of this won't help you survive. In fact, it might make things worse. Let's start with the most basic challenge you'll face, the sheer overwhelming assault on your senses. The moment you step out of whatever dwelling you've been assigned, you'll be hit by a wall of stench so powerful it will make your eyes water and your throat close up. Medieval cities were essentially open sewers. Human waste was dumped into the streets from chamber pots, often without warning to pedestrians below. Dead animals lay where they fell, rotting in the sun. The fresh water sources were contaminated with everything from industrial runoff to human waste. Your modern nose, accustomed to the relatively clean air of the 21st century, will be under constant assault. The smell of unwashed bodies, rotten food, animal waste, and industrial processes will be so overpowering that you'll find yourself gagging constantly. And this is before you even encounter your first plague victim. The clothing you're expected to wear will be another immediate challenge. Your plague doctor costume isn't just a costume, it's a complex, heavy, and incredibly uncomfortable protective system that will make every movement a struggle. The leather overcoat, designed to protect you from the corrupted air that medieval people believed spread the plague, is thick, heavy, and completely non-breathable. Within minutes of putting it on, you'll be sweating profusely, and by the end of your first hour, you'll be soaked through. The famous beaked mask, perhaps the most iconic part of the plague doctor's outfit, is far more claustrophobic than you might imagine. The beak, filled with aromatic herbs and spices that were believed to purify the air, severely restricts your vision and breathing. You'll find yourself constantly struggling to get enough air, and the herbs will irritate your respiratory system, making you cough and wheeze. The glass eyepieces will fog up regularly, leaving you stumbling around half-blind. But the real psychological challenge begins when you encounter your first patient. You're led to a small dark house in the merchant quarter, where a family of 5 is huddled in a single room. The father, a wool trader named Henry, is lying on a straw mattress, his body racked with fever. His wife Marie is trying to tend to him while also caring for their 3 children, all of whom are showing early signs of the disease. Your modern mind immediately recognizes the symptoms: the high fever, the painful swelling of the lymph nodes, the dark patches of skin that indicate internal bleeding. You know this man is dying, and you know that without modern antibiotics, there's virtually nothing you can do to save him. But the family is looking at you with such desperate hope, such complete faith in your abilities, that you feel the weight of their expectations crushing down on you. Marie approaches you, her hands clasped together in prayer. "Please, doctor," she whispers, "my husband is a good man. He's never harmed anyone. Surely God will listen to your prayers." She believes that you have some special connection to the divine, that your medical knowledge is somehow tied to divine intervention. In her mind, you're not just a doctor, you're an intermediary between the earthly and heavenly realms. This is where your modern understanding of medicine becomes both a blessing and a curse. You know that prayer won't save Henry, but you also know that telling his family this will destroy their last hope. You know that the treatments you're expected to perform, bloodletting, applying poultices, balancing the humors, are not only useless but potentially harmful. Yet if you refuse to perform them, you'll be seen as incompetent or worse, as someone who has abandoned their sacred duty. The tools you're expected to use are crude and terrifying. Your medical bag contains an array of instruments that look more like torture devices than healing tools. There are bloodletting lancets, rusted and dull from repeated use. There are bone saws for amputating limbs that have become gangrenous. There are metal probes for examining wounds, with no concept of sterilization or infection control. Every tool is a potential vector for spreading the very disease you're trying to combat. The bloodletting process alone would be enough to send most modern people into shock. You're expected to make deep cuts in the patient's arms or legs, allowing blood to flow freely into bowls or basins. The theory, based on ancient Greek medicine, is that you're removing the corrupted blood that's causing the illness. In reality, you're weakening patients who are already fighting for their lives, making them more susceptible to secondary infections and hastening their death. But it gets worse. As you move through the city, you'll encounter scenes that will haunt your dreams for years to come. Entire families dead in their homes, their bodies beginning to decompose in the summer heat. Children wandering the streets, orphaned and confused, calling out for parents who will never answer. Mass graves being dug outside the city walls, where bodies are dumped without ceremony or dignity. The social fabric of medieval society is completely unprepared for a catastrophe of this magnitude. There are no government agencies to coordinate relief efforts, no public health departments to track the spread of disease, no emergency services to help the sick and dying. The only organized response comes from the Church, which sees the plague as divine punishment for mankind's sins and focuses more on spiritual salvation than medical intervention. As a plague doctor, you're expected to fill multiple roles that would be divided among dozens of specialists in the modern world. You're a physician, a surgeon, a psychiatrist, a social worker, and a spiritual counselor all rolled into one. You're expected to diagnose diseases you've never seen, perform surgical procedures you've never learned, and provide comfort to people who are facing the most terrifying experience of their lives. The patients you encounter will present with symptoms that will test every limit of your psychological endurance. The bubonic form of the plague causes the lymph nodes to swell to enormous size, sometimes as large as apples, filled with pus and blood. When these buboes burst, they release a torrent of infected fluid that spreads the disease to anyone nearby. The pneumonic form attacks the lungs, causing victims to cough up blood and foam at the mouth. The septicemic form causes internal bleeding that turns the skin black, giving the plague its nickname, the Black Death. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the plague is how quickly it can progress. A person can wake up feeling perfectly healthy and be dead by sunset. You'll watch as vibrant, healthy individuals are reduced to corpses in a matter of hours. The psychological impact of witnessing this kind of rapid deterioration, over and over again day after day, will be overwhelming. Your modern understanding of grief and trauma counseling means you'll recognize the signs of psychological breakdown in both your patients and yourself. You'll see the denial, anger, bargaining, depression and acceptance that people go through when facing death. But you'll also see psychological responses that aren't covered in modern textbooks. The complete breakdown of social norms, the abandonment of children by parents, the hoarding of resources by the wealthy while the poor are left to die in the streets. The economic impact of the plague will also affect your ability to function as a doctor. As the disease spreads, trade routes are disrupted, and the flow of goods into the city slows to a trickle. The exotic herbs and spices that are supposed to fill your protective mask become unavailable. The wine that's used to sterilize wounds is hoarded by the wealthy. Even basic supplies like cloth for bandages become scarce as the textile workers fall ill or flee the city. Your payment for your services will likely come in the form of goods rather than money. As the monetary system begins to break down, families will offer you their most precious possessions in exchange for treating their loved ones: jewelry, artwork, religious relics, even their homes. The ethical implications of accepting payment from people who are about to die will weigh heavily on your modern conscience. The social hierarchy of medieval society will also present challenges that you're not prepared for. As a plague doctor, you'll be expected to treat people from all social classes, from wealthy merchants to poor peasants. But the quality of care you're expected to provide will vary dramatically based on your patient's social status. The wealthy will expect you to stay with them for hours, providing comfort and performing elaborate rituals. The poor will be lucky to receive a few minutes of your attention. Your modern sense of equality and human dignity will be constantly challenged by a society that sees some lives as inherently more valuable than others. You'll be expected to prioritize the treatment of a wealthy merchant over a poor family, even if the poor family's condition is more treatable. You'll be expected to provide expensive treatments to those who can afford them, while offering only basic care to those who cannot. The religious aspects of medieval medicine will also be a constant source of conflict for your modern sensibilities. Every treatment you perform is expected to be accompanied by prayer and religious ritual. You'll be expected to determine whether a patient's illness is the result of sin, demonic possession, or divine punishment. You'll be expected to perform exorcisms alongside medical treatments and to recommend confession and penance as part of the healing process. The Church's interpretation of the plague as divine punishment will put you in an impossible position. If you successfully treat a patient, it's seen as proof that God has forgiven their sins. If you fail, it's seen as proof that their sins are too great to be forgiven. Your medical skill is seen as secondary to your spiritual power, and your failures are interpreted as moral failures rather than medical limitations. The tools of medieval medicine will seem primitive and barbaric to your modern eyes. Surgical procedures are performed without anesthesia, with patients either held down by force or given alcohol to dull the pain. Amputations are performed with saws and knives that would be rejected by modern butchers. Wounds are cauterized with red-hot iron, causing excruciating pain and often making infections worse rather than better. The diagnostic methods you'll be expected to use are based on theories that you know to be completely wrong. You'll be expected to examine a patient's urine, looking for changes in color, consistency, and smell that supposedly indicate different types of illness. You'll be expected to feel for the patient's pulse but not to count heartbeats per minute. Instead, you'll be looking for qualities like strength, weakness, heat, and cold that have no medical meaning. The concept of contagion, while beginning to be understood in some circles, is still largely rejected by mainstream medieval medicine. You'll be expected to work closely with infected patients without any real understanding of how disease spreads. The protective gear you're wearing is designed to protect you from bad air, not from contact with infected bodily fluids. You'll be expected to examine patients' buboes with your bare hands, to taste their urine as part of your diagnosis, and to sleep in the same buildings where infected patients are being treated. Your modern understanding of the importance of hygiene will be constantly frustrated by the realities of medieval life. There's no concept of sterilization, no understanding of the importance of washing hands between patients, no recognition that the same instruments shouldn't be used on multiple patients without cleaning. You'll watch as the very tools you're using to help people actually spread the disease from one patient to another. The psychological pressure of being one of the few people in the city who's expected to have answers will be overwhelming. As the plague spreads and the death toll rises, desperate people will look to you for explanations, for hope, for miracles. They'll ask you questions that you can't answer. Why is this happening? When will it end? Will their loved ones survive? Is there anything they can do to protect themselves? Your modern knowledge tells you that this plague will burn itself out eventually, that approximately 1/3 of the population will die, and that life will eventually return to something approaching normal. But you can't share this knowledge without revealing that you're not from this time period. You have to watch people make decisions based on fear and ignorance, knowing that their choices will often make things worse. The isolation you'll experience as a plague doctor will be profound. Your protective gear marks you as someone who deals with death and disease, making you a figure of both reverence and terror. People will cross the street to avoid you, children will run away when they see you coming, and even other medical professionals will keep their distance. You'll be simultaneously essential and untouchable, needed and feared. The constant exposure to death and suffering will begin to affect your mental health in ways you're not prepared for. You'll develop what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, but without any understanding of what's happening to you or how to cope with it. You'll experience nightmares, anxiety, depression, and a growing sense of helplessness that will make it increasingly difficult to function. The physical toll of the job will be equally challenging. The heavy protective gear will cause constant fatigue and muscle strain. The limited vision and restricted breathing will lead to headaches and dizziness. The constant exposure to the smoke and fumes that are supposed to purify the air will irritate your respiratory system. The lack of proper nutrition, as food becomes scarce and expensive, will weaken your immune system and make you more susceptible to the very disease you're trying to fight. As the plague spreads beyond the city walls, you'll be expected to travel to other communities, carrying your medical knowledge to places where it's desperately needed. But travel in medieval Europe is dangerous under the best of circumstances, and during a plague outbreak, it becomes nearly impossible. Roads are blocked by quarantines, bridges are guarded by armed men trying to keep infected travelers out of their communities, and the normal network of inns and way stations breaks down as proprietors either flee or die. The political implications of the plague will also affect your work in ways you're not prepared for. As the death toll rises, local governments will begin to collapse. The mayor who hired you might die, leaving you without official backing or protection. Rival political factions might blame the plague on their enemies, accusing them of poisoning wells or practicing witchcraft. You might find yourself caught in the middle of these conflicts, accused of being part of a conspiracy to spread the disease. The economic disruption caused by the plague will make it increasingly difficult to obtain the supplies you need to do your job. The trade routes that bring exotic medicines from the east will be disrupted. The local craftsmen who make medical instruments will either flee the city or die. The farmers who grow the herbs you need for your treatments will abandon their fields. You'll find yourself trying to treat the most challenging medical cases of your career with an increasingly limited set of tools and resources. The social changes brought about by the plague will also challenge your modern understanding of how society functions. As the death toll rises, traditional family structures will break down. Children will be orphaned, spouses will be widowed, and entire family lines will be wiped out. The careful social hierarchies that define medieval society will be disrupted as people from all classes die at similar rates. This breakdown of social order will create opportunities for social mobility that would be impossible under normal circumstances, but it will also create chaos and uncertainty that will make your job even more difficult. You'll encounter situations where no one knows who has the authority to make medical decisions, where property ownership is in dispute, and where the normal rules of society no longer apply. The plague will also accelerate existing social tensions in ways that will make your position precarious. Long-standing resentments between different ethnic and religious groups will boil over into violence. Jewish communities will be blamed for the plague and subjected to horrific persecution.
Foreign merchants will be accused of bringing the disease to the city. Anyone who seems different or unusual will become a target for mob violence. As a plague doctor, you'll be in a particularly vulnerable position during these outbreaks of violence. Your protective gear makes you easily identifiable, and your association with the disease makes you a natural target for people looking for someone to blame. You'll need to navigate these dangerous social currents while continuing to provide medical care to anyone who needs it. The religious crisis created by the plague will also affect your work in profound ways. Many people will lose faith in God, questioning how a benevolent deity could allow such suffering. Others will become more religious, interpreting the plague as a sign of the approaching end times. Some will join flagellant movements, believing that physical self-punishment will appease God's wrath. Others will abandon all moral constraints, believing that the end of the world is near. These religious responses will often conflict with your medical work. Patients might refuse treatment, believing that their illness is God's will. Families might demand that you perform religious rituals instead of medical procedures. Community leaders might ban medical treatments, arguing that they interfere with divine judgment. You'll find yourself caught between your medical training and the religious beliefs of the people you're trying to help. The constant exposure to death will also challenge your own spiritual beliefs in ways you're not prepared for. You'll be forced to confront fundamental questions about the nature of existence, the meaning of suffering, and the possibility of an afterlife. The sheer scale of the tragedy unfolding around you will make it difficult to maintain any sense of hope or purpose. Your modern understanding of psychology tells you that this kind of existential crisis is a normal response to trauma, but medieval society has no framework for understanding or dealing with these issues. You'll be expected to maintain your composure and continue working, regardless of your own emotional state. There will be no counseling services, no support groups, no mental health professionals to help you process what you're experiencing. The physical danger of your job will also be greater than you might expect. Desperate people will sometimes blame doctors for their loved ones' deaths, leading to physical attacks. You'll be working in areas where law and order have broken down, making you vulnerable to robbery and violence. The protective gear that's supposed to keep you safe will also make you a target for people who want to steal it. The plague will also attract charlatans and false doctors who will try to take advantage of the crisis to make money. You'll find yourself competing with people who have no medical training but who promise miracle cures. These fake doctors will often be more popular than legitimate physicians because they offer hope where real medicine can only offer honesty about the limitations of treatment. The documentation and record keeping that's so important to modern medicine will be virtually impossible in the chaotic conditions of a plague outbreak. You won't be able to track the progression of the disease, monitor the effectiveness of treatments, or maintain detailed patient records. This lack of systematic information will make it difficult to improve your medical practice or to share knowledge with other doctors. The legal implications of your work will also be challenging. Medieval society has complex laws governing medical practice, and you'll be expected to navigate these legal requirements while dealing with a crisis that's unprecedented in its scope. You might be held legally responsible for patients' deaths, sued by families who feel you didn't do enough to save their loved ones, or prosecuted for practicing medicine without proper credentials. The language barriers you'll encounter will also make your job more difficult. Medieval Europe is a patchwork of languages and dialects, and you'll encounter patients who speak languages you don't understand. Medical terminology is still developing, and the same symptoms might be described using completely different words in different regions. You'll need to learn to communicate complex medical concepts using simple, universal language. The seasonal nature of the plague will also affect your work in ways you're not prepared for. The disease tends to be more active during certain times of the year, creating periods of intense activity followed by relative calm. You'll need to use the quiet periods to prepare for the next outbreak, gathering supplies, training assistants, and caring for your own health. The international nature of the plague will also create challenges that are beyond your control. News of outbreaks in other cities will create panic and chaos, even before the disease arrives. Refugees from infected areas will strain local resources and potentially bring the disease with them. International trade will be disrupted, making it difficult to obtain supplies and medicines. The technological limitations of medieval medicine will be a constant source of frustration. There are no microscopes to examine samples, no laboratory tests to confirm diagnoses, no X-rays to see inside the body. You'll be making life and death decisions based on limited information, using tools that are crude and imprecise. The preservation of medical knowledge will also be challenging. Books are expensive and rare, and there's no printing press to quickly reproduce important texts. Medical knowledge is passed down through apprenticeship and oral tradition, making it vulnerable to loss when doctors die or flee. You'll be working with incomplete and sometimes contradictory information, trying to piece together effective treatments from fragmentary sources. The scale of the plague will also be overwhelming in ways that are difficult to comprehend. In a single day you might encounter more death and suffering than a modern doctor sees in an entire career. The sheer number of patients will make it impossible to provide adequate care to everyone who needs it. You'll be forced to make triage decisions, choosing who to treat and who to let die, based on limited resources and imperfect information. The long-term consequences of the plague will also affect your work in ways you're not prepared for. The massive death toll will create labor shortages that will disrupt every aspect of society. The survivors will be traumatized and changed by their experiences. The economic and social structures that existed before the plague will be permanently altered. As we reach the end of this first part of our journey, it's clear that the challenges facing a plague doctor are far greater than most people realize. The combination of medical, social, economic, religious, and psychological pressures would be overwhelming for anyone, but they're particularly challenging for someone with modern sensibilities who understands the true scope of the tragedy they're witnessing. In the next part of our story, we'll explore the specific medical challenges you'll face, the treatments you'll be expected to perform, and the heartbreaking reality of medieval healthcare during one of history's greatest catastrophes. We'll see how your modern knowledge, rather than being an advantage, often becomes a burden that makes your job even more difficult. But for now, let these images settle in your mind: the narrow streets filled with smoke and the smell of death, the desperate faces of families begging for miracles you can't provide, the heavy weight of the protective gear that marks you as someone who walks between the world of the living and the dead. This is the world you've entered, and it's only the beginning of your journey as a medieval plague doctor.
Now that you've survived your first few hours in medieval Marseille, let's explore what happens when you're actually called upon to practice medicine. The morning sun filters through the narrow windows of your temporary quarters, and you can hear the church bells of Saint-Laurent echoing across the city. Today you'll discover that knowing about medieval medicine and actually practicing it are two completely different experiences. A frantic knock at your door interrupts your breakfast of stale bread and watered wine. A young boy, no more than 10 years old, stands before you with tears streaming down his dirt-stained face. "Please, Master Doctor," he pleads. "My mother, she's burning with fever, and the swellings under her arms are as large as eggs. The priest says she's beyond saving, but surely your learning can help her." You follow the boy through the winding streets, your heavy leather coat already making you sweat, despite the cool morning air. The weight of your medical bag pulls at your shoulder, filled with instruments that you know will be largely useless against what you're about to encounter. Your modern mind races with treatments that won't be invented for centuries: antibiotics, IV fluids, oxygen therapy, pain management. But your hands can only reach for the crude tools of medieval medicine. The boy leads you to a building that leans precariously over the narrow street, its upper floors jutting out so far they nearly touch the structure across the way. You climb a steep, narrow staircase that creaks ominously under your weight. The air grows thicker with each step, heavy with the smell of human sweat, urine, and something else that makes your stomach clench with recognition. In a small room barely large enough for a bed, you find the boy's mother, Catherine, lying on a straw mattress that's soaked with sweat and other bodily fluids. She's conscious but delirious, her eyes rolling back as she mutters prayers in a voice so hoarse it's barely audible. Her husband Pierre, a blacksmith by trade, kneels beside the bed, his massive hands folded in prayer. "She was fine yesterday morning," Pierre tells you, his voice cracking with emotion. She helped me with the morning meal, tended to the children, even went to market. But by evening, she was complaining of pain in her back and legs. By midnight she was burning with fever. And now, he gestures helplessly at the woman on the bed. You examine Catherine as best you can through your fogged glass eyepieces. Her fever is dangerously high, and you can see the telltale swellings, the buboes that give bubonic plague its name. They're located in her armpits and groin, hard and painful to the touch. Her skin has taken on a greyish pallor, and dark patches are beginning to appear on her extremities, indicating that the infection has spread to her bloodstream. Your modern medical training tells you exactly what's happening inside Catherine's body. The Yersinia pestis bacteria, transmitted by the bite of an infected flea, has entered her lymphatic system. Her lymph nodes are swelling as her immune system desperately tries to fight off the infection. The bacteria is producing toxins that are causing systemic inflammation, organ failure, and internal bleeding. Without modern antibiotics, her chances of survival are less than 40%, and even with treatment, she would require intensive care. But you can't explain any of this to her family. The very concept of bacteria won't be understood for centuries. Instead, you must work within the framework of medieval medicine, which attributes illness to an imbalance of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to this theory, Catherine's fever indicates an excess of hot, wet humours that must be removed from her body. Pierre looks at you expectantly. What can you do for her, doctor? We've saved every coin we could spare. Tell us what treatment she needs. This is where your modern knowledge becomes a torment rather than a blessing. You know that the most effective treatment would be streptomycin or gentamicin, antibiotics that won't be discovered for another 6 centuries. You know that she needs fluid replacement, fever reduction, and possibly respiratory support. But the treatments you're expected to perform will likely make her condition worse. You open your medical bag and remove the instruments that medieval medicine considers essential. First, there's the bloodletting equipment, a small sharp knife called a phleem, a brass bowl to catch the blood, and strips of cloth to bind the wound afterward. The theory behind bloodletting is that you're removing the corrupted blood that's causing the fever. In reality, you're about to weaken an already critically ill patient. She has too much hot blood, you tell Pierre, using the language of medieval medicine. I must remove some of it to restore the balance of her humours. The words feel strange and wrong coming from your mouth, but they're what the family expects to hear. You make a deep cut in Catherine's arm, and blood flows freely into the bowl. In her weakened state, she barely reacts to the pain. You let approximately 2 cups of blood drain from her body, about a pint, before binding the wound. Pierre watches with a mixture of hope and horror as his wife's blood fills the bowl. Is that enough? He asks. Should we take more? Your modern medical training screams that you've already done too much, that you've just made a critically ill patient even weaker. But medieval medicine suggests that more bloodletting might be necessary. Some doctors of this era would remove up to a quarter of a patient's blood, believing that this would cure even the most serious illnesses. We'll see how she responds, you tell him, knowing that the bloodletting will likely make her fever worse and accelerate her decline. If the fever doesn't break by tomorrow, we may need to take more. Next, you turn your attention to the buboes themselves. Medieval medical theory suggests that these swellings contain the poisonous matter that's causing the illness. The standard treatment is to lance them, allowing the infected pus to drain out. You know this is dangerous. It will likely spread the infection and cause excruciating pain. But it's what's expected. You heat a small knife over a candle flame, not for sterilization, but because medieval medicine believes that hot instruments are more effective at removing disease. Catherine's husband holds her down as you prepare to cut into the largest bubo under her arm. This will hurt, you warn her, though she's too delirious to fully understand. But it will release the poison that's making you sick. You make a deep incision in the swollen lymph node. An infected pus mixed with blood flows out. Catherine screams in agony, a sound that cuts through you like a knife. Her body convulses with pain, and you have to hold her down to prevent her from injuring herself further. The smell that rises from the wound is nauseating, and you're grateful for the herbs in your mask that help mask the stench. Pierre crosses himself and mutters a prayer as he watches his wife suffer. Is this helping her? He asks desperately. It seems to be causing her such pain. The poison must be released, you tell him. though your modern knowledge tells you that you've just created an open wound that will likely become infected. The pain shows that the treatment is working. You repeat the process with the other buboes, each incision causing Catherine to scream again. By the time you're finished, she's lost consciousness from the pain and shock. Her breathing is shallow and rapid, and her pulse is weak and thready. You know that you've just made her condition significantly worse, but this is the standard treatment that medieval medicine demands. Next, you prepare poultices to apply to the opened wounds. These are made from a mixture of herbs, animal fat, and other substances that medieval doctors believe will draw out the remaining poison. You crush garlic, onions and various herbs together, mixing them with goose fat, and a small amount of ground unicorn, actually narwhal tusk, that Pierre has managed to obtain at great expense. As you apply the poultices to Catherine's wounds, you know that you're probably introducing more bacteria into her system. The herbs and animal fat are not sterile, and the crude bandages you're using have never been properly cleaned. But this is the state of medieval medicine, where the very treatments designed to help often cause more harm. What else can we do? Pierre asks, his voice filled with desperation. Are there other treatments? You know that medieval medicine has several other options, none of which will actually help Catherine. There's cauterization, where the buboes are burned with red-hot irons. There's the application of live chickens or other animals to the swellings, based on the belief that they will draw out the disease. There are complex astrological calculations to determine the best times for treatment. We could try cupping, you suggest, referring to another common medieval treatment. This involves placing heated glass cups on the patient's skin to create suction, supposedly drawing out the bad humors. It's painful and ineffective, but it's expected. You heat several glass cups over a candle flame, and quickly place them on Catherine's back and chest. The suction creates dark purple marks on her skin, and she moans in pain even in her unconscious state. The theory is that the suction will draw the corrupted blood to the surface, where it can be removed. In reality, you're just causing more trauma to an already critically ill patient. As you work, you can't help but think about the treatments that could actually help Catherine. A course of antibiotics would kill the bacteria causing her infection. IV fluids would help replace what she's lost through sweating and blood loss. Pain medication would make her more comfortable. Anti-inflammatory drugs would reduce her fever and the swelling in her lymph nodes. But these treatments might as well be magic for all the good they do you now. You're trapped in a time when the most advanced medical knowledge is based on theories that are centuries out of date, using treatments that often cause more harm than good. Should we call for the priest? Pierre asks quietly. Should she receive the last rites? This question highlights another aspect of medieval medicine that you're not prepared for. Medical treatment and spiritual care are inextricably linked in this era. Every illness is seen as having both physical and spiritual components, and doctors are expected to address both aspects. You're not just treating Catherine's body, you're also supposed to be caring for her soul. Not yet, you tell Pierre, though you know that Catherine's condition is deteriorating rapidly. Let's see how she responds to the treatment, but it wouldn't hurt to have her confess her sins just in case. The integration of medicine and religion in medieval times creates constant ethical dilemmas for your modern sensibilities. You're expected to determine whether Catherine's illness is caused by sin, demonic possession, or simply a natural imbalance of humors. You're expected to prescribe prayer and penance alongside your medical treatments. You're expected to consult astrological charts to determine the best times for treatment. The family brings in the local priest, Father Jean, a thin man with kind eyes who has been ministering to plague victims throughout the city. He performs the sacrament of confession with Catherine, even though she's barely conscious. He anoints her with holy oil, and leads the family in prayer. God's will be done, Father Jean says as he finishes the rites. But surely your medical knowledge can help her, doctor. You've studied the ancient texts, learned the secrets of healing. Can you not save her? This is the crushing weight of expectation that every medieval plague doctor carried. People believed that medical knowledge was almost magical, that a learned doctor could cure any illness, if only they applied the right treatment. They didn't understand that medicine, even modern medicine, has limitations. They expected miracles, and when those miracles didn't happen, they often blamed the doctor rather than the disease. I'm doing everything I can, you tell the priest, though you know that everything you're doing is probably making Catherine worse. The outcome is in God's hands. As the day progresses, Catherine's condition continues to deteriorate. Her fever spikes higher, and she begins to cough up blood, indicating that the infection has spread to her lungs. The dark patches on her skin are spreading, showing that the bacteria has entered her bloodstream. Her breathing becomes labored, and she occasionally convulses. You try other medieval treatments, each one as ineffective as the last. You burn aromatic herbs in the room, believing that the smoke will purify the air. You prepare complex mixtures of herbs and minerals, forcing them down Catherine's throat even though she can barely swallow. You consult astrological charts to determine whether the position of the planets is favorable for treatment. The stars are not aligned properly, you tell Pierre, using the language of medieval medicine. Mars is in conjunction with Saturn, which makes healing more difficult. We may need to wait for a more favorable alignment. Pierre nods solemnly, accepting this explanation even though your modern mind knows it's complete nonsense. But in medieval times, astrology was considered a legitimate medical science, and doctors were expected to time their treatments according to celestial events. As night falls, you realize that you've been working for nearly 12 hours straight. Your protective gear is soaked with sweat, and you're exhausted both physically and emotionally. The weight of your medical bag seems to have doubled, and every step is an effort. But Catherine's condition is getting worse, and the family continues to look to you for answers. Is there nothing else we can do? Pierre asks, his voice barely above a whisper. Are there no other treatments? You know that medieval medicine has several other options, but they're all variations on the same ineffective themes. There's trepanation, where holes are drilled in the skull to release evil spirits. There's the use of mercury and other toxic substances that are believed to purge the body of disease. There are complex bloodletting schedules based on the patient's astrological sign. We could try a different approach, you suggest, though you know it won't help. Some doctors believe that the disease can be transferred to another creature. We could try placing a live chicken against the buboes, or perhaps a toad. This is one of the most bizarre treatments in medieval medicine, based on the belief that certain animals can absorb disease from humans. The theory is that the animal will die, taking the disease with it, and the patient will recover. In reality, it's just another ineffective treatment that wastes precious time. Pierre nods eagerly, willing to try anything. Yes, let's try that. I'll find a chicken. As Pierre leaves to find a chicken, you're alone with Catherine for the first time. Her breathing is so shallow that you have to watch carefully to see if her chest is moving. Her pulse is weak and irregular, and her skin is cold and clammy. You know that she's dying, and there's nothing you can do to save her. Your modern medical training tells you that Catherine is going into septic shock. Her blood pressure is dropping, her organs are shutting down, and her body is no longer able to maintain basic functions. In a modern hospital, she would be in the intensive care unit, connected to machines that monitor her vital signs and provide life support. But here in a medieval bedroom, you can only watch as her life slowly ebbs away. Pierre returns with a live chicken, which he holds uncertainly in his hands. What do I do with it? He asks. Place it against the largest bubbo, you instruct him, though every part of your modern sensibilities rebels against this absurd treatment. Hold it there for as long as possible. The chicken will absorb the disease from her body. Pierre follows your instructions, pressing the terrified chicken against his wife's swollen lymph node. The bird struggles and squawks, adding to the surreal nature of the scene. You watch this medieval ritual with a mixture of professional obligation and personal revulsion, knowing that it's completely useless, but unable to suggest anything better. After an hour, the chicken dies, not from absorbing Catherine's disease, but from stress and being held in an uncomfortable position. Pierre looks at you hopefully. Does this mean the treatment worked? Will she recover now? You examine Catherine again, though you already know what you'll find. Her condition hasn't improved at all. If anything, she's gotten worse. Her breathing is more labored, her pulse is weaker, and the dark patches on her skin have spread further. The chicken absorbed some of the disease, you tell Pierre, using the language of medieval medicine. But the illness is strong, we may need to try other treatments. This is the cruel reality of medieval medicine. Doctors were expected to continue trying treatments, even when it was clear that the patient was dying.
Giving up was seen as a failure of medical knowledge or spiritual faith. Doctors were expected to fight until the very end, even when their treatments were causing more suffering. As the second night approaches, you realize that you've been awake for nearly 24 hours. Your exhaustion is profound, affecting your judgment and your ability to think clearly. In modern medicine, there are regulations that limit how long doctors can work without rest, recognizing that fatigue leads to medical errors. But in medieval times, plague doctors were expected to work until they collapsed. Catherine's breathing becomes increasingly irregular, and you know that the end is near. Her family gathers around her bed, praying and holding her hands. Pierre looks at you with desperate hope, still believing that your medical knowledge can save her. Is there nothing else? He asks one final time. No other treatment. You know that there are other medieval treatments you could try, but they would only cause more suffering without providing any benefit. You could bleed her again, lance more buboes, apply more poultices, or try various herbal remedies. But your modern conscience finally rebels against causing more pain to a dying woman. We've done everything we can, you tell Pierre, the words heavy with the weight of your modern knowledge. Now we must pray. Catherine dies just before dawn, her breathing simply stopping as her exhausted body finally gives up the fight. Pierre breaks down in tears, and their children, who have been watching from the corner, begin to cry. The young boy who came to fetch you looks at you with confusion and disappointment. But you're a doctor, he says, his voice filled with the innocent expectation that doctors can cure any illness. Why couldn't you save her? This is perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of being a medieval plague doctor. The constant expectation that you can perform miracles, combined with the reality that most of your treatments are ineffective or harmful. You're forced to watch people die despite your best efforts, and you're often blamed for your failures. God called her home, you tell the boy, using the religious language that people expect to hear. There was nothing more we could do. But privately, you know that Catherine might have survived if she had been born in a different time. Modern antibiotics could have cured her infection. Modern supportive care could have helped her body fight off the disease. Modern pain management could have made her final hours more comfortable. As you pack up your medical instruments, you realize that you've just experienced what will be repeated thousands of times across Europe over the next few years. The treatments you've performed will be the standard care for plague victims, and most of them will die despite your efforts. The psychological toll of watching so many people die, knowing that you can't save them, will be overwhelming. Pierre pays you with a small bag of silver coins, money that represents a significant portion of his family's savings. Thank you for trying, he says, though you can see the disappointment in his eyes. At least we know that everything possible was done. As you leave the house, you realize that you've just learned a fundamental truth about medieval medicine. It's not just about treating disease, it's about managing expectations and providing comfort to families who are facing the unthinkable. Your role as a plague doctor is as much about psychology and pastoral care as it is about medicine. The walk back to your quarters gives you time to reflect on what you've just experienced. Your modern medical training has prepared you to diagnose Catherine's condition and understand exactly what was happening to her body. But it hasn't prepared you for the emotional toll of watching someone die when you know that effective treatments exist, but are centuries away from being discovered. You also realize that the treatments you've performed, despite being the standard care of the time, have probably shortened Catherine's life rather than extending it. The bloodletting weakened her when she needed all her strength to fight the infection. The lancing of her buboes created open wounds that became infected. The various poultices and treatments exposed her to additional bacteria and caused unnecessary pain. This is the central paradox of medieval medicine. The very treatments designed to help often cause more harm. Doctors of this era are working with the best knowledge available to them, but that knowledge is based on theories that are fundamentally wrong. They're trying to help their patients, but they're often making them worse. As you reach your quarters, you're confronted with another reality of medieval medical practice. There's no time to rest or recover. Another family is already waiting for you, desperate for help with their sick child. The plague is spreading rapidly through the city, and as one of the few doctors available, you're in constant demand. The next case is even more challenging than Catherine's. A prosperous merchant named Bernard has developed the pneumonic form of the plague, which attacks the lungs rather than the lymph nodes. He's coughing up blood and foam, and his breathing is so labored that he can barely speak. His family has converted their entire ground floor into a makeshift hospital room, with expensive tapestries and religious icons surrounding his bed. We've heard about your success with the bloodletting and bubo treatments, Bernard's wife Marie tells you. We want you to use every treatment available. Money is no object. This presents you with an ethical dilemma that you're not prepared for. You know that the treatments you performed on Catherine were not only ineffective but probably harmful. Yet this family expects you to perform the same treatments, and they're willing to pay handsomely for them. Your modern medical ethics tell you to first do no harm, but medieval medicine expects you to try every available treatment, regardless of its effectiveness. You're caught between your modern knowledge and the expectations of your time. The pneumonic form is different from the bubonic form. You explain to Marie, using medical terminology that she doesn't understand. The treatments must be adapted accordingly. What you don't tell her is that pneumonic plague is even more deadly than bubonic plague, with a mortality rate approaching 100% in medieval times. Bernard is coughing up infected droplets with every breath, making him highly contagious. Everyone in the room is at risk of infection, including you. The treatments for pneumonic plague are just as ineffective as those for bubonic plague. You're expected to bleed the patient to reduce the fever, apply poultices to the chest to draw out the infection, and use various herbal remedies to clear the lungs. None of these treatments will help, and some will make the patient's condition worse. As you begin to treat Bernard, you realize that you're not just fighting the plague, you're fighting the entire medical system of medieval Europe. Every treatment you perform is based on theories that you know to be wrong, using methods that you know to be harmful. Yet you're expected to continue, because this is the only medicine available. The psychological pressure is immense. You're watching people die, knowing that you can't save them, while their families look to you for miracles. You're performing treatments that you know are useless, while maintaining the appearance of medical expertise. You're caught between your modern knowledge and the expectations of medieval society. As Bernard's condition deteriorates, you realize that you're facing a choice that every medieval plague doctor had to make. Do you continue to perform ineffective treatments to meet the expectations of your patients and society, or do you admit that medicine has limitations, and focus on providing comfort and support? The weight of this decision will follow you throughout your career as a plague doctor. Every patient you treat will force you to confront the limitations of medieval medicine, and the gap between what people expect you to do, and what you're actually able to accomplish. In the next part of our story, we'll explore how the plague spreads through the city, the social breakdown that accompanies the epidemic, and the impossible choices that plague doctors had to make when faced with more patients than they could possibly treat. We'll see how the very structure of medieval society begins to crumble under the weight of this unprecedented catastrophe. But for now, as you stand in Bernard's sick room, listening to his labored breathing and watching his family's desperate faces, you begin to understand why being a medieval plague doctor was one of the most challenging and heartbreaking professions in human history.
3 weeks have passed since you first donned the leather coat and beaked mask of a plague doctor. The city of Marseille is transforming before your eyes, not through war or natural disaster, but through something far more insidious, the slow, inexorable collapse of everything that holds a community together. Today you'll discover that treating individual patients was only the beginning of your challenges. Now you must navigate a world where the very foundations of civilization are crumbling. The morning begins like so many others, with the tolling of church bells across the city. But something is different today. Instead of the usual complex melodies that mark the hours and call people to prayer, you hear only the monotonous death knell, a single bell ringing slowly, repeatedly, announcing another death, and another, and another. The sound has become so constant that it blends into the background noise of the city, like the sound of rain or wind. You step outside your quarters and immediately notice the changes. The streets, once bustling with merchants, craftsmen, and townsfolk going about their daily business, are now eerily quiet. Many of the shops are closed, their wooden shutters barred and marked with hastily painted crosses, to warn away potential customers. The few people you see move quickly, their heads down, clutching herbs or amulets they hope will protect them from the plague. A young woman approaches you, her face pale with fear and exhaustion. She's well dressed, clearly from a merchant family, but her fine clothes are wrinkled and stained. "Doctor," she calls out, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, you must come. My entire household, they're all sick. My husband, my children, the servants, everyone except me." This is becoming a common scenario. Entire families are being wiped out by the plague, leaving lone survivors who don't understand why they've been spared. You follow the woman, whose name is Isabel, through streets that seem to grow emptier with each passing day. Dogs roam freely, their owners either dead or fled. Cats huddle in doorways, thin and desperate for food. How many are sick, you ask as you walk, though you already know the answer will be overwhelming. 7, she replies, her voice breaking. "My husband Philippe, our 3 children, and 3 of our servants. They all fell ill within 2 days of each other. I keep waiting for the sickness to take me too, but it hasn't. Why has God spared me only to watch everyone I love die?" This is one of the most psychologically devastating aspects of the plague. The seemingly random nature of who lives and who dies. Modern medicine understands that some people have natural resistance to certain diseases, that genetics and previous exposures can affect susceptibility. But medieval people see only the hand of God, and survivors often struggle with guilt and religious confusion. You arrive at Isabel's house, a 3-story building that speaks of considerable wealth. The ground floor, normally used for business, has been converted into a makeshift hospital. The scene that greets you is unlike anything you've encountered before, not because of the severity of the illness, but because of the sheer number of patients crammed into one space. The 7 sick family members are laid out on makeshift beds, ranging from Philippe, a man in his 40s, to little Marie, who cannot be more than 5 years old. The different stages of the disease are represented here, like a textbook illustration. Philippe appears to be in the final stages, his breathing labored and his skin taking on the blackened appearance that gives the plague its name. The children are in various earlier stages, some still conscious and crying for their mother, others delirious with fever. "I don't know what to do," Isabel confesses, wringing her hands. "I've been trying to care for them all, but there are so many, and they need different things. Some want water, others push it away. Some burn with fever, others are cold as ice. I don't know who to help first." This is the moment when you realize that your medical training, focused on treating individual patients, is completely inadequate for the reality of a plague epidemic. You're not just a doctor anymore, you're a triage officer, a family counselor, a spiritual advisor, and a manager of resources. You have to make decisions that will determine who lives and who dies, and you have to make them quickly. Your modern medical training includes triage protocols, systems for prioritizing patients based on the severity of their condition and the likelihood of survival. But these protocols were developed for modern hospitals with unlimited resources, not for medieval plague houses with no effective treatments. In this situation, your triage decisions are essentially decisions about who deserves to suffer less before they die. You examine each patient quickly, your modern knowledge allowing you to assess their conditions more accurately than any medieval doctor could. Philippe is clearly dying, his pulse is weak and irregular, his breathing is shallow, and the dark patches on his skin indicate that the infection has spread throughout his body. Little Marie, despite her young age, is in the early stages of the disease and might have a chance of survival if she receives adequate care. But here's the impossible reality: you can't save any of them. Not with medieval medicine. The best you can do is make their final days or hours more comfortable, and try to prevent the spread of the disease to Isabel and any other survivors. "We need to separate them," you tell Isabel, making a decision that goes against medieval medical practice. Those who are sickest should be in one room, those who might still recover in another. This is one of the few areas where your modern knowledge might actually help. You understand the concept of isolation and quarantine in ways that medieval medicine does not. But implementing these concepts in a medieval household is nearly impossible. There aren't enough rooms, enough servants, or enough resources to properly isolate patients. "But they're my family," Isabel protests. "I can't abandon any of them. They need to be together." The emotional and practical challenges of isolation during a plague outbreak are immense. Families want to be together during their final moments, but staying together increases the risk of spreading the disease. Children cry for their parents, spouses refuse to leave each other's sides, and patients in their delirium call out for loved ones. You compromise by setting up different areas within the same large room, using curtains and screens to create some separation. It's not ideal, but it's the best you can do under the circumstances. You show Isabel how to minimize contact with the sickest patients while still providing basic care. As you work, you become aware of sounds from the street outside, not the normal sounds of city life, but something more troubling. Shouting, the sound of running feet, the crash of breaking glass. You look out the window and see a crowd of people gathered around a house 2 streets away. What's happening? Isabel asks, joining you at the window. Through the narrow medieval streets you can see smoke rising from the house. The crowd is throwing stones and torches, and you can hear voices shouting accusations. Poisoners, someone yells. They've poisoned the wells. This is one of the most disturbing aspects of plague outbreaks, the tendency for communities to look for scapegoats. When people can't understand why a disaster is happening, they often blame minority groups, foreigners, or anyone who seems different. In medieval Europe, Jewish communities were particularly targeted, accused of causing the plague by poisoning wells or practicing witchcraft. We should stay inside, you advise Isabel, though part of you feels a moral obligation to help whoever is being attacked. There's nothing we can do for them, and going out might put your family at risk. But even as you say this, you know that you're contributing to the breakdown of social order. In normal times, people would intervene to stop mob violence. They would call for the authorities, organize neighborhood watch groups, or at least bear witness to what was happening. But during a plague outbreak, everyone is so focused on their own survival that the normal bonds of community dissolve. The sounds from the street grow louder, and you realize that the violence is spreading. Windows are being broken, shops are being looted, and the normal forces of law and order are nowhere to be seen. The city guards, those who haven't died or fled, are overwhelmed by the scale of the crisis. Doctor, a weak voice calls from behind you. It's Philippe, Isabel's husband, struggling to sit up in his bed. What's happening out there? You turn back to your patients, but the sounds from the street make it difficult to concentrate. This is another challenge that medieval plague doctors faced, trying to provide medical care, while society collapsed around them. The breakdown of law and order made it dangerous to move through the city, difficult to obtain supplies, and nearly impossible to maintain the social connections that medical practice depends on. Some people are frightened, you tell Philippe, trying to keep your voice calm. They're looking for someone to blame for the sickness. Philippe nods weakly. I've heard rumors, he whispers. People saying that foreign merchants brought the plague, that the Jews are poisoning the wells, that the church is being punished for its sins. Everyone has a theory, but no one has answers. This is the epistemological crisis that accompanies any major disaster, the human need to understand why bad things happen, combined with the lack of accurate information. In medieval times, without modern scientific understanding, people relied on superstition, religious explanations, and scapegoating to make sense of the incomprehensible. You continue treating Philippe and his family, but the work is constantly interrupted by developments outside. A group of flagellants, religious fanatics who believe that physical self-punishment will appease God's wrath, processes down the street, whipping themselves bloody while chanting prayers. Their cries mix with the sounds of the mob violence, creating a cacophony of human suffering. Should we join them? Isabel asks, watching the flagellants through the window. Should we punish ourselves for our sins? This is another impossible decision that plague doctors had to navigate. Medieval society was deeply religious, and many people interpreted the plague as divine punishment for sin. Some believed that physical penance, extreme devotion, or radical lifestyle changes would protect them from the disease. Others believed that the plague was a sign of the approaching end times, and that normal moral rules no longer applied. Focus on caring for your family, you advise Isabel. That's the most important thing you can do right now. But even as you say this, you know that you're navigating complex theological waters. If the plague is divine punishment,
then medical treatment might be seen as interfering with God's will. If it's a sign of the end times, then normal social obligations might no longer apply. If it's caused by sin, then the focus should be on spiritual rather than physical healing. The afternoon brings a new crisis. A delegation of city officials arrives at your door, led by a man you recognize as John de Rochefort, one of the surviving members of the city council. He's accompanied by 2 guards and a priest, and their faces are grim with purpose. "Doctor," John says, without preamble, "we need to speak with you about the quarantine regulations." You step outside to speak with them, leaving Isabel to tend to her family. The city officials explain that they're implementing emergency measures to try to control the spread of the plague. Houses where plague victims are found will be sealed shut, with the sick and healthy family members locked inside together. Red crosses will be painted on the doors to warn others to stay away. But that will ensure that everyone in the house gets sick. You protest, your modern understanding of disease transmission making you realize how counterproductive this measure will be. "It's necessary to protect the rest of the city," John replies. "We can't allow infected people to wander the streets, spreading the disease to healthy families." This is one of the most morally complex aspects of plague management, the tension between individual rights and public health. The quarantine measures being implemented are crude and often ineffective, but they're the only tools available to medieval authorities. You understand the logic behind them, but you also know that they will likely result in the death of many people who might otherwise survive. "What about medical care?" you ask. "If families are locked in their houses, how will they receive treatment?" "That's why we're here," the priest Father Michel explains. "We're organizing a system where doctors and priests will make regular visits to quarantined houses. You'll be assigned a district to oversee." The scope of what they're asking hits you like a physical blow. You're being asked to become responsible for the medical care of an entire district, dozens of houses, hundreds of people. With medieval medicine's limited effectiveness, you'll essentially be presiding over a mass dying, moving from house to house to provide comfort to people you can't save. "How many other doctors are still working?" you ask, though you already suspect the answer. 3, John admits. 3 doctors for the entire city. 2 others have died, and 4 have fled. This is the reality of plague medicine. The doctors who are most needed are also the most likely to become infected and die. Your protective gear provides some protection, but it's not foolproof. Every patient you treat, every house you visit, increases your risk of contracting the disease you're trying to fight. "We understand the danger," Father Michel says, reading your expression. "But these people need care, and you're one of the few qualified to provide it. Will you accept this responsibility?" The weight of this decision is enormous. Accepting means committing to weeks or months of exposure to the plague, visiting house after house full of dying people, providing treatments that you know are ineffective. Refusing means abandoning hundreds of people to die without any medical care at all. "I'll do it," you say, though every instinct tells you that this is a death sentence. "But I'll need supplies, assistance and some way to communicate with the other doctors. We'll provide what we can," John promises, though you can see in his eyes that resources are severely limited. But you must understand, the city is on the edge of complete collapse. The normal systems that we depend on are breaking down. As if to emphasize his point, a group of armed men rides past, their horses laden with household goods and supplies. They're not soldiers or city guards, they're looters, taking advantage of the chaos to enrich themselves. One of them eyes your group with interest, noting the official nature of your gathering. "Even the criminal elements are becoming bolder," John observes. "Without effective law enforcement, people are taking what they want by force." This is another aspect of plague life that medieval doctors had to navigate. The breakdown of property rights and social order. Houses were abandoned as families died or fled, leaving valuable goods unprotected. The desperate poor began to take what they needed to survive, while opportunistic criminals saw the chaos as a chance for profit. You return to Isabel's house to find that the situation has deteriorated further. Little Marie has taken a turn for the worse, and Philippe appears to be in his final hours. The other patients are in various stages of decline, and Isabel is near collapse from exhaustion and stress. "I can't keep this up," she admits, tears streaming down her face. I haven't slept in 3 days. I haven't eaten a proper meal in a week. I feel like I'm losing my mind. This is the psychological toll that the plague takes on survivors. The constant stress, the lack of sleep, the inadequate nutrition, the overwhelming responsibility of caring for multiple sick family members. Isabel is experiencing what modern psychology would recognize as acute stress disorder, but medieval medicine has no framework for understanding or treating mental health issues. You need to rest, you tell her, though you know that rest is nearly impossible under these circumstances. Even if it's just for a few hours, you can't help them if you collapse. But even as you say this, you know that rest is a luxury that few people can afford during a plague outbreak. There's always someone who needs care, always another crisis to handle, always another decision to make. The normal rhythms of life, eating, sleeping, working, are completely disrupted by the constant presence of death. As evening approaches, you face a decision that will become routine over the coming weeks. You have more patients than you can possibly treat effectively, limited supplies, and a growing list of houses that need visits. You have to choose how to allocate your time and resources, knowing that every choice means that some people will receive less care than others. Philippe dies just as the sun sets, his breathing simply stopping as his family gathers around his bed. Isabel breaks down completely, sobbing over her husband's body while her children cry out for their father. The servants, those who are still conscious, mutter prayers and cross themselves. What happens now? Isabel asks through her tears. How do I bury him? How do I care for the rest of my family? This is where the breakdown of social systems becomes most apparent. In normal times, Philippe's death would be followed by a complex series of rituals, preparing the body, holding a wake, organizing a funeral, settling his estate. But during a plague outbreak, these normal social processes are impossible. We'll have to take him to the mass grave outside the city walls. You tell Isabel, though you know how horrifying this sounds to her. Individual burials are no longer possible. The mass graves are one of the most disturbing aspects of plague outbreaks. The sheer number of deaths makes individual burials impossible, so bodies are collected daily and buried in large pits outside the city. There's no ceremony, no individual grave markers, no way for families to visit their loved ones. It's a necessity, but it violates every social and religious norm about how the dead should be treated. But he was a good man, Isabel protests. He deserves a proper burial, in consecrated ground, with his family around him. I know, you reply, though you know that your words provide little comfort. But these are extraordinary circumstances. God will understand. As you speak, you realize that you're not just providing medical care, you're also providing psychological support, spiritual counseling and social services. The plague has broken down the normal division of labor that exists in healthy societies. Teachers, lawyers, craftsmen and merchants have all either died or fled, leaving the remaining doctors to fill multiple roles. The night brings new challenges. The sounds of violence from the streets grow louder, and you realize that the breakdown of law and order is accelerating. Fires can be seen burning in several parts of the city, and the sounds of shouting and breaking glass echo through the narrow streets. Should we barricade the doors? Isabel asks, her voice filled with fear. It might be wise, you agree, though you know that this will make it harder for you to leave and visit other patients. But we need to be able to get out if there's a fire. This is the impossible balance that plague doctors had to maintain, protecting themselves from violence and civil unrest, while still being available to provide medical care. The normal social contract, where people followed laws and respected authority, has broken down. Now everyone is focused on their own survival, and the normal protections that doctors enjoyed are gone. You spend the night in Isabel's house, taking turns keeping watch and caring for the remaining patients. 2 more family members die during the night. One of the servants and Isabel's middle child, a boy of 8. Each death is accompanied by the same heartbreaking scene. Family members crying, prayers being said, and the terrible realization that there's nothing anyone can do to stop the progression of the disease. By morning, only 3 patients remain alive. Isabel's youngest daughter, 1 servant, and Isabel herself, who has finally begun to show symptoms of the plague. The fever came on suddenly during the night, and by dawn, she's developed the characteristic swellings in her neck and armpits. I knew this would happen. she says with a strange calm. I've been waiting for it. In some ways it's a relief. I won't have to watch everyone else die. This is the fatalistic acceptance that many plague victims develop. After watching family members die one by one, survivors often welcome their own infection as an end to the psychological torture of being left behind. The guilt of surviving when others don't can be overwhelming, and death begins to seem like a mercy. We're not giving up, you tell Isabel, though you know that her chances of survival are minimal. We'll continue to fight this. But even as you say this, you know that you're fighting a losing battle. The plague is spreading faster than you can treat it. The city's infrastructure is collapsing, and the social bonds that hold communities together are dissolving. You're not just treating a disease, you're witnessing the collapse of civilization itself. The morning brings news that makes the situation even worse. A messenger arrives with word that the plague has spread to the surrounding countryside, cutting off the city's supply lines. Food is becoming scarce, and the prices of basic necessities are skyrocketing. The wealthy are hoarding supplies, while the poor are beginning to starve. How long can this continue? The messenger asks you, looking for some kind of professional opinion about when the plague might end. I don't know, you admit, though your modern knowledge tells you that this epidemic will last for several more years. These things run their course eventually, but it could be months or even years. The messenger nods grimly and continues on his rounds, carrying news of the disaster from house to house. You realize that you're not just treating individual patients, you're part of a communication network that's trying to hold the city together as it falls apart. As you prepare to leave Isabel's house and visit the other families in your assigned district, you realize that you've crossed a psychological threshold. You're no longer thinking about saving individual lives. You're thinking about managing a mass disaster. Your role has evolved from doctor to crisis manager, and the decisions you make will affect hundreds of people. The weight of this responsibility is crushing. In modern times, disaster management involves teams of specialists, government agencies, and international relief organizations. But in medieval times, the responsibility falls on a handful of individuals who are woefully unprepared for the scope of the crisis. You look back at Isabel's house, now marked with the red cross that designates it as a plague house. Inside, 3 people are dying, and there's nothing you can do to save them. Outside, the city is collapsing around you, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. This is the moment when many medieval plague doctors broke down completely. The combination of medical helplessness, social chaos, and personal danger was too much for most people to bear. Some fled the city, abandoning their patients and their professional obligations. Others continued working until they died, driven by a sense of duty that was stronger than their fear. As you walk through the empty streets toward your next patient, you realize that you're facing the same choice that every plague doctor had to make. Continue fighting a battle you can't win, or abandon the people who are counting on you to save them. The next house on your list is even worse than Isabel's. An entire extended family of 12 people, ranging from infants to grandparents, all crowded into a small dwelling. The smell that greets you when the door opens is so overwhelming that you have to steady yourself against the door frame. Doctor, the patriarch of the family, an elderly man named Guillaume, greets you with desperate relief. Thank God you've come. We're all dying, and no one knows what to do. As you survey the scene inside the house, you realize that this is what the collapse of civilization looks like. Not dramatic battles, or spectacular disasters, but the quiet dissolution of the social bonds that hold communities together. Families dying alone, neighbors afraid to help each other, and the normal institutions of society simply ceasing to function. In the next part of our story, we'll explore how the plague affects different social classes, the impossible choices that doctors had to make when resources ran out, and the long-term psychological effects of witnessing such widespread death and destruction. We'll see how the plague changed not just individual lives, but the entire structure of medieval society. But for now, as you step into Guillaume's house, and are overwhelmed by the scope of the tragedy before you, you begin to understand why so many plague doctors eventually broke down under the pressure. The human mind simply wasn't designed to cope with disaster on this scale, and the social structures that normally provide support and meaning are the first casualties of any epidemic.
6 weeks have passed since you first walked through the gates of Marseille as a plague doctor. The city you entered no longer exists. In its place stands something that resembles a settlement from the end of the world, a place where the normal rules of society, economics, and human interaction have been suspended, replaced by the harsh mathematics of survival. Today, you'll face the ultimate test of your role as a plague doctor, not just treating the sick, but deciding who deserves treatment when there isn't enough to go around. You'll witness how the plague strips away the artificial barriers between social classes, revealing the raw humanity that lies beneath wealth, status, and privilege. And you'll discover that the most difficult decisions a doctor can make aren't medical ones, they're moral ones. The morning begins with a messenger at your door, a boy of perhaps 12, whose family has clearly sent him out to work because they need the money. His clothes are patched and threadbare, but his eyes are bright with intelligence and determination. "Doctor," he says, slightly out of breath from running, "you're needed at the merchant's quarter. The alderman's family is sick, and they're offering gold for treatment." Before you can respond, another voice calls out from the street. "Doctor, please." It's a woman's voice, desperate and cracked with exhaustion. You look out to see a peasant woman, her clothing marking her as one of the city's poorest residents, carrying a child who can't be more than 3 years old. "My daughter," she gasps. "She's burning with fever. Please, just look at her." This is the moment when the theoretical becomes brutally practical. You have limited time, limited supplies, and limited energy. The alderman's family can pay for treatment, ensuring that you'll have resources to continue your work. The peasant woman has nothing to offer except her gratitude and her desperate need. In normal times, this wouldn't be a choice. You would treat whoever needed help most urgently. But these aren't normal times. The messenger shifts impatiently. "Sir, the alderman's wife specifically requested that you come immediately. She says she'll pay 10 gold pieces for a consultation. 10 gold pieces is more money than most people in the city see in a year. It's enough to buy medicine, food, and supplies that could help dozens of other patients. But it's also a reward for abandoning this poor woman and her child to treat someone whose only advantage is wealth." You look at the child in the woman's arms. Even from a distance you can see the telltale signs of plague, the fever, the swellings, the glazed look in her eyes. She's in the early stages of the disease, which means she has the best chance of survival of any patient you might see today. The alderman's family, having sent a messenger rather than coming themselves, might be in later stages of the illness where treatment is less likely to be effective. "What's your name?" you ask the peasant woman. "Marie," she replies, shifting the child to get a better grip. "Marie de Boer, this is my daughter Sylvie. She's all I have left. My husband died last month, and my other children, they're already gone." This is the human face of the plague's social impact. The disease doesn't discriminate based on wealth or status. It kills rich and poor alike, but its effects are felt most severely by those who have the least resources to cope with disaster. The wealthy can flee to country estates, stockpile food and medicine, and pay for the best available care. The poor must remain in the city, crowded into tenements where disease spreads quickly, unable to afford treatment, or even basic necessities. "I'll examine your daughter first," you decide, though you know this choice will have consequences. "Then we'll go to the alderman's house." The messenger looks shocked. "But sir, the alderman's family is paying for immediate service. They're expecting you now." "They'll have to wait," you reply, though you know that this decision might cost you a valuable source of income and supplies. This child needs immediate attention. As you examine little Sylvie, you're struck by how the plague has revealed the artificial nature of social hierarchies. Here in your hands is a child who, in normal times, would be considered less valuable than the alderman's hunting dogs. Her mother works as a laundress, scrubbing clothes in the river for a few coins a day. She owns nothing, has no political influence, and will never be remembered by history. But under your examining hands, Sylvie is simply a sick child who needs help. The fever that burns through her small body doesn't care about her social class. The swellings that mark the plague's progress don't distinguish between noble and peasant blood. In the democracy of disease, all patients are equal. The fever is high, but not dangerously so, you tell Marie, though you know that the situation could change rapidly. The swellings are small, which is a good sign. She has a chance, but she needs constant care. Marie's face lights up with hope, though you can see the exhaustion in her eyes. "What do I need to do?" "I'll do anything. Keep her cool and hydrated," you advise, knowing that this simple treatment is as effective as anything medieval medicine can offer. Bathe her with cool water, give her small sips of clean water mixed with honey if you can find any, and keep her away from other people. The disease spreads through close contact. But doctor, Marie says, her voice dropping to a whisper, I don't have honey, I don't have clean water, I don't even have a proper place to keep her cool. We live in one room above the bakery, and the baker's wife won't let me use her well anymore. She's afraid of the plague. This is the brutal reality of plague medicine for the poor. The treatments that might help are often impossible to implement because of lack of resources. Clean water, nutritious food, cool rooms, and isolation are luxuries that only the wealthy can afford. The poor are forced to care for their sick family members in crowded, unsanitary conditions that make recovery nearly impossible. You reach into your bag and pull out a small vial of honey that you've been saving for emergencies. Take this, you tell Marie. Mix a small amount with water, not too much, or it will make her stomach upset. And here, you add, giving her a small piece of clean cloth. Use this to bathe her face and neck. Marie takes the supplies with trembling hands, tears streaming down her face. Thank you, doctor. God bless you. I don't know how to repay you. Take care of your daughter, you reply. That's payment enough. As you prepare to leave for the alderman's house, you realize that you've just made a decision that perfectly illustrates the moral complexity of plague medicine. You've given away supplies that you might need later, potentially compromising your ability to treat other patients. You've also delayed responding to a wealthy family that could provide resources for future treatments, but you've also provided hope to a mother and child who had none. The walk to the merchant's quarter reveals another aspect of how the plague affects different social classes. The streets here are cleaner than in the poor districts, not because the wealthy are immune to disease, but because they have the resources to maintain better sanitation. The houses are larger, with more space for isolation. Many of the wealthy families have fled to their country estates, leaving their city houses empty and protected by hired guards. But wealth provides no ultimate protection from the plague. The alderman's house, when you reach it, displays the same red cross that marks plague houses throughout the city. The same smell of sickness greets you at the door. The same desperate faces look to you for salvation that you cannot provide. The alderman's wife, Lady Catherine, meets you at the door herself, a breach of protocol that shows how desperate the situation has become. In normal times, a woman of her social standing would never answer her own door, especially to a tradesman like a doctor. But the plague has broken down many social conventions. Doctor, she says, her voice controlled but strained, thank you for coming. My husband is very ill, and my son, I fear for his life. Lady Catherine leads you through the house, which shows clear signs of wealth even in its current state of crisis. The rooms are spacious, the furniture is well made, and there are servants' quarters that in normal times would house a staff of 6 or 8 people. But now, you see only 2 servants, both of them showing early signs of the plague. How many people in the household are sick, you ask, as you walk? 5, Lady Catherine replies. My husband, my son, and 3 of our servants. The others fled when the sickness began, taking some of our silver with them. This is another way that the plague affects different social classes. The wealthy depend on large staffs of servants to maintain their lifestyle, but during a plague outbreak, these servants often flee to protect their own families. The rich are left to care for themselves, often for the first time in their lives. You're led to the alderman's chamber, a large room with expensive tapestries and fine furniture. But the grandeur of the setting cannot mask the reality of what you find there. Alderman Robert de Montpellier, one of the most powerful men in the city, lies in his bed looking like any other plague victim. His face is flushed with fever, his breathing is labored, and the characteristic swellings are visible on his neck. Doctor, he says weakly when he sees you, I'm told you're the best physician still working in the city. My family will pay whatever you ask if you can save my son. This is the moment when you confront the fundamental inequality of medieval medicine. The alderman assumes that his wealth can buy him better treatment, better medicine, better chances of survival, and in many ways, he's right. His family can afford to pay for your time and attention, while poor families like Marie's cannot. But the plague is one of the few diseases that truly doesn't care about social class. The treatments that might help the alderman are the same ones that might help little Sylvie. The fever that burns through his noble blood is the same fever that affects peasant children. Your medical knowledge and skills are equally effective, or ineffective, regardless of who is paying for them. I'll do everything I can, you tell the alderman, though you know that everything is very little. But I need to examine your son first. The alderman's son Jacques is in the next room, attended by his mother and one of the surviving servants. He's a boy of about 15, well-fed and well-dressed, with the soft hands of someone who has never done manual labor. But like little Sylvie, he's burning with fever and struggling with the swellings that mark the plague's progress. As you examine Jacques, you're struck by the similarities between him and Sylvie. Both are young people in the early stages of the disease. Both have loving parents who are desperate to save them. Both are facing the same struggle for survival. The main difference is that Jacques is surrounded by luxury, while Sylvie is trapped in poverty. What are his chances? Lady Catherine asks, her voice barely controlled. The same as any other patient, you reply honestly. The disease progresses differently in different people. Some recover, others don't. His youth is in his favor, but beyond that, I cannot make predictions. This is not the answer that wealthy families expect to hear. They're accustomed to having their problems solved through the application of money and influence. The idea that their son's life depends on the same random factors that affect peasant children is almost incomprehensible to them. But surely, Lady Catherine insists, there must be better treatments available. We've heard of physicians in Paris who have new methods, new medicines. We can pay for the best care. There are no better treatments, you tell her, though you know this is difficult for her to accept. The plague is beyond our current understanding. All we can do is provide comfort and hope for the best. The alderman, overhearing this conversation from his bed, struggles to sit up. Doctor, my family has connections throughout the region. We can obtain rare medicines, hire additional physicians, even transport my son to monasteries where holy men might pray for his recovery. Money is no object. This is the fundamental delusion of wealth in the face of catastrophe. The alderman believes that his resources can somehow overcome the limitations of medieval medicine. He's accustomed to solving problems through the application of money and influence, and he cannot accept that some problems are beyond the reach of wealth. I understand your desire to help your son, you reply gently, but hiring more physicians won't change the fact that we don't have effective treatments. Rare medicines are just as likely to be useless as common ones, and transportation to a monastery might expose him to additional dangers. As you speak, you realize that you're not just providing medical advice, you're challenging the fundamental assumptions of medieval society. The idea that wealth and status should translate into better outcomes is so deeply ingrained that questioning it feels almost heretical. But the plague has taught you that some things are beyond human control, regardless of social class. Death comes to rich and poor alike, and the grief of a wealthy mother is no different from the grief of a peasant woman. The fever that burns through noble blood is the same fever that affects commoners. The afternoon brings a new challenge that illustrates the moral complexity of resource allocation. A group of city officials arrives at the alderman's house, led by the same Jean de Rochefort, who had spoken to you about quarantine measures. They're accompanied by a cart loaded with supplies, medicine, food and clean water, obtained through the city's emergency fund. Doctor, Jean says, we have supplies for distribution, but not enough for everyone who needs them. We need your professional opinion on how to allocate them. This is the moment when you realize that your role as a plague doctor extends far beyond treating individual patients. You're being asked to make decisions that will determine who lives and who dies on a city-wide scale. The supplies on the cart could help dozens of families, but there are hundreds who need them. How do we decide who gets what? You ask, though you already know that any system will be inherently unfair. That's what we're hoping you can tell us, Jean replies. Some people are arguing that we should prioritize the wealthy, since they contribute more to the city's economy. Others say we should focus on the poor, since they have the greatest need. Still others think we should prioritize young people, since they have the most years of life ahead of them. Each of these arguments has merit, but each also has moral problems. Prioritizing the wealthy reinforces social inequalities, and suggests that some lives are worth more than others. Prioritizing the poor might seem more equitable,
but it ignores the contributions that wealthy families make to the city's economy and culture. Prioritizing the young means abandoning older people who might recover with proper care. What about prioritizing based on medical need, you suggest? Give the supplies to those who are most likely to benefit from them. But how do we determine that? Jean asks. You're the only doctor with enough experience to make those judgments, and you can't examine every patient in the city. This is the practical impossibility of rational resource allocation during a disaster. The decisions need to be made quickly, with limited information, and by people who don't have the expertise to make them properly. Any system will be imperfect, and any choice will result in some people receiving help while others are abandoned. We'll have to establish priorities, you decide reluctantly. First, we help those who are most likely to recover. Second, we help those who are caring for others, parents with children, people taking care of sick relatives. Third, we help those who are performing essential services, bakers, water carriers, people who keep the city functioning. It's a reasonable system, but you know that it will be nearly impossible to implement fairly. How do you determine who is most likely to recover without examining every patient? How do you verify that someone is actually caring for others, rather than just claiming to be? How do you decide which services are truly essential when the entire city is falling apart? What about social class? Jean asks. Shouldn't we consider the contributions that different families make to the city? This is the question that gets to the heart of medieval society's values. The wealthy and powerful assume that their contributions to the city's economy and culture make them more deserving of help. The poor argue that their need is greater, and that they have been neglected by society for too long. Medical need should be the primary consideration, you reply, though you know that this ideal will be difficult to maintain in practice. The plague doesn't care about social class, and neither should our response to it. As you speak, you realize that you're advocating for a radical principle, that all lives have equal value, regardless of wealth or status. This is a principle that medieval society nominally accepts in religious terms, but rarely applies in practical situations. The debate continues for nearly an hour, with various officials arguing for different approaches. Some want to prioritize their own districts, others want to focus on particular neighborhoods, and still others want to reserve supplies for city officials and their families. Everyone has reasons why their preferred approach is most logical and fair. Finally, you make a decision that will define your legacy as a plague doctor. We'll distribute the supplies in order of when requests are received, you announce. First come, first served, no exceptions for wealth, status, or personal connections. There's immediate protest from several officials. But that's completely arbitrary, one exclaims. It doesn't take into account any rational criteria. Any system we create will be arbitrary, you reply. At least this one is fair in its arbitrariness. Everyone has an equal chance. It's not a perfect solution, but it's the most equitable one you can devise under the circumstances. The first come, first served system means that little Sylvie has the same chance of receiving supplies as the alderman's son Jack. The peasant woman Marie has the same opportunities as Lady Catherine. The implementation of this system reveals just how difficult it is to maintain fairness during a disaster. Wealthy families send servants to wait in line, giving them multiple opportunities to receive supplies. Some people falsify their situations, claiming to have more sick family members than they actually do. Others use bribes or threats to move ahead in line. But despite these problems, the system works better than any alternative would. Over the following days, you see supplies reaching families that would never have received help under a wealth-based system. Poor families receive medicine and food that allows them to care for their sick relatives. Middle-class families that have lost their primary breadwinners receive help that prevents them from falling into destitution. The psychological impact of this fair distribution system is as important as its practical effects. For the first time since the plague began, people feel that someone is trying to treat them equitably. The rich are not automatically prioritized over the poor. The powerful are not given special treatment. Everyone is subject to the same rules and the same random chances. But the system also reveals the harsh mathematics of disaster relief. Even with fair distribution, there simply aren't enough supplies to help everyone who needs them. For every family that receives help, several others are turned away. The plague continues to spread, and the city continues to die. As the weeks pass, you watch the effects of the plague on different social classes with growing understanding. The wealthy suffer less from the disease itself, but they suffer more from the psychological impact of losing their privileged position. They're accustomed to having their problems solved through the application of money and influence, and the plague's indifference to wealth is profoundly disturbing to them. The poor suffer more from the physical effects of the disease, but they're more psychologically prepared for hardship. They've lived with uncertainty and deprivation throughout their lives, so the plague represents an intensification of existing problems rather than a completely new experience. The middle classes, the merchants, craftsmen, and skilled workers, perhaps suffer the most overall impact. They have enough to lose that the plague represents a real catastrophe, but not enough resources to protect themselves effectively. They fall between the social safety nets that exist for the very rich and the very poor. But the plague also reveals the common humanity that exists beneath social distinctions. When Lady Catherine watches her son struggle with fever, her grief is identical to Marie's grief over little Sylvie. When the alderman faces his own mortality, his fear is no different from that of the poorest peasant. When families are torn apart by death, the pain is the same regardless of social class. 3 months after your arrival in Marseille, you're summoned to a meeting of the remaining city officials. The group that gathers is much smaller than it would have been before the plague. Many officials have died, and others have fled the city. Those who remain are exhausted, traumatized, and desperate for any sign of hope. Dr. Jean de Rochefort says, his voice heavy with fatigue, "We need to discuss the future. The plague shows no signs of ending, and we're running out of resources. Some people are suggesting that we abandon the city entirely. This is the ultimate failure of medieval urban civilization, the point at which a city becomes uninhabitable and must be abandoned. It's happened before in history, and it will happen again. But the decision to abandon Marseille would mean admitting that all the efforts to fight the plague have been futile. How many people are left, you ask, though you already know the answer will be devastating. Perhaps 2,000, Jean replies, out of a population of 15,000 just 3 months ago, and many of those who remain are sick or dying. The numbers are staggering. The plague has killed or driven away nearly 90% of the city's population. The elaborate social structure that once defined Marseille, the guilds, the noble families, the merchant networks, the religious institutions, has been almost completely destroyed. What would abandoning the city mean, you ask? The remaining healthy people would be relocated to other cities, or to the countryside. Jean explains. The city would be sealed off and left to the plague. Anyone who chooses to stay would be on their own. This is the final test of your commitment as a plague doctor. You could leave with the healthy refugees, abandoning your medical practice, but saving your own life. Or you could stay with the sick and dying, continuing to provide what little help you can, until the plague finally claims you as well. How many other doctors are left, you ask? You're the only one, Jean admits. The other 2 died last week. The weight of this revelation is crushing. You are the only trained medical practitioner remaining in a city of 2,000 people. If you leave, the remaining residents will face the plague with no medical care whatsoever. If you stay, you'll be signing your own death warrant. I need time to consider this, you tell the officials, though you already know what your decision will be. That night, you walk through the empty streets of Marseille, reflecting on everything you've witnessed during your time as a plague doctor. The city that once bustled with life is now quiet as a tomb. Grass grows between the cobblestones. Houses stand empty with their doors hanging open. The only sounds are the occasional cry of a sick person or the howl of feral dogs. But you also remember the moments of grace you've witnessed. Marie's tears of gratitude when you helped her daughter. The alderman's recognition that his wealth couldn't save his son. The fair distribution of supplies that gave everyone an equal chance. The way the plague stripped away social pretensions and revealed the common humanity that connects all people. You think about little Sylvie, who recovered from the plague and now helps care for other sick children. You think about Jack, the alderman's son, who died despite his family's wealth and status. You think about the thousands of people who have died in your care, and the hundreds who have survived because of your help. The next morning, you give Jean de Rochefort your decision. I'm staying, you tell him. These people need medical care, and I'm the only one who can provide it. Jean nods, though you can see the sadness in his eyes. I expected as much, he says. You're a good man, Doctor. History will remember your sacrifice, but you know that history will likely forget you entirely. Medieval plague doctors were rarely remembered by name, and the records of their work were often lost in the chaos that followed major epidemics. You're not staying for historical recognition, you're staying because it's the right thing to do. As the healthy refugees prepare to leave the city, you're faced with a final decision about resource allocation. The departing officials offer to leave you with supplies and money that could help you care for the remaining patients, but they also point out that taking these resources would mean less support for the refugees who are trying to rebuild their lives elsewhere. Take what you need, Jean tells you. You've earned it, but you decline most of the offer, taking only basic medical supplies and enough food to sustain yourself. The refugees need these resources more than I do, you explain. They have a chance to build new lives. I'm just buying time for people who are dying. This final act of resource allocation defines your legacy as a plague doctor. Even when faced with your own impending death, you continue to put the needs of others first. You continue to make the impossible choices that define medical practice during a disaster. As the last of the refugees leave Marseille, you're left alone with the remaining 2,000 residents. Most of them are sick or dying, but some are healthy survivors who have chosen to stay with their families rather than abandon them. These people become your final patients, your final responsibility. In the weeks that follow, you establish a routine that will define your remaining time as a plague doctor. You make daily rounds through the city, visiting the sick and dying in their homes. You distribute the dwindling supplies as fairly as possible. You provide comfort to the grieving and hope to the desperate. The work is exhausting and ultimately futile. The plague continues to claim lives, and your own infection is probably inevitable. But you continue because the alternative, abandoning these people to die alone, is unthinkable. And in this final phase of your service as a plague doctor, you discover something that all the medical training in the world couldn't teach you. The most important thing you can provide isn't medicine or treatment, it's presence. The knowledge that someone cares, that someone is willing to stay and help even when the situation is hopeless. The story of your time as a medieval plague doctor ends not with dramatic heroics or miraculous cures, but with quiet dedication to an impossible task. You couldn't save the city of Marseille, and you couldn't defeat the plague, but you could provide comfort to the dying, hope to the desperate, and fair treatment to all people regardless of their social class. In the end, that's what being a plague doctor really meant, not the strange costume or the primitive treatments, but the willingness to stand between humanity and catastrophe, even when there was no chance of victory. It was the choice to serve others even when self-preservation would have been more logical. And as you continue your rounds through the dying city, visiting the sick and comforting the grieving, you understand that this choice, the choice to stay and help even when help seems futile, is what separates civilization from chaos. It's what makes us human, even in the face of inhuman disaster. The plague will eventually end, as all plagues do. The survivors will rebuild, as survivors always do. But the choices you made as a plague doctor, the decision to treat rich and poor equally, to stay when others fled, to provide comfort when cure was impossible, those choices will echo through history, remembered not in books or monuments, but in the fundamental human understanding that some things are worth doing even when they cannot succeed.